So welcome to day 12 of Shadowhunters month, and this is another top 10 video. This time I'm going to be talking about my top 10 favourite book moments. So obviously this isn't really going to be talking about the show, it's going to be talking about moments in the books that may have happened in the show, but because there are books outside the Mortal Instruments, if you're just watching with an interest for the show, you may not know everything I'm talking about, and obviously I'm not really going to be talking much about the show in this top 10 because this is one of the more book focused videos in Shadowhunters month. So yeah, I found this actually quite difficult to not to narrow down. I actually came up with 10 things quite easily, but actually ordering them more like the lower end of the list, not like my favourite ones. I kind of knew what my favourite ones were going to be, but like the 8, 9, 10 kind of area, I struggled to really list those ones, but you know, I did it in the end. So yeah, these are my top 10 book moments, and let's get right into it. And obviously spoilers for the books if you haven't read them, because I'm going to be talking about Mortal Instruments, Infernal Devices, Dark Artifices, and I believe Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy as well. So if you haven't read any of those, or you don't want to be spoiled, whatever, maybe read those and then come back to this another time, because there will be spoilers for all of those books and events, characters, stuff like that. So without further ado, let's get into the top 10. So at number 10, it's Simon becoming a vampire in City of Ashes. This is kind of the trouble with, kind of the trouble, kind of not, with watching season 1 of the show before I started reading the books. Because obviously I knew Simon was going to become a vampire at some point. Although what surprised me actually getting around to reading the books was that he became a vampire really early on in the show, like episode 7 in the show, whereas it wasn't until book 2 of the Mortal Instruments that Simon actually became a vampire. So I was actually kind of surprised when I finished the first book and he wasn't a vampire. So there's still kind of the shock factor there when, you know, he died at the start of book 2, well, near the start. So yeah, that was kind of a pretty big deal. And we had, you know, his lifeless body being brought in, and then Clary burying him, you know, deciding to bring him back, and that whole kind of struggle throughout the second book with Simon, trying to become a vampire and going away, having his time to kind of get used to the whole idea. Just like the emotional stakes behind it, and I was still really shocked when it actually happened, even though I knew it was going to at some point. And I thought it was just written really beautifully and in such a melancholy way, that I just really loved how the whole thing was handled. So at number 9, it's Emma and Julian hooking up in Lady Midnight. I know you shouldn't really ship Parabatai together, because I know you're not really, you know, it's against the law to be romantically involved with your Parabatai. But that didn't stop Emma and Julian, because they fell in love, and they totally did it on a beach. Well, in a cave on a beach, I think. And I'd kind of been rooting for them for the whole book. You know, we had Julian kind of painting Emma on the walls in like his art studio, if you will. And we had the whole book of both of them kind of really struggling with their feelings for each other. And, you know, near-death experience, stuff like that. And they just gave in to their feelings, and it was kind of a punch-the-air moment. 'Cause you know you shouldn't be rooting for them, because they're Parabatai, and this is against the law. But they'd established their connection so well by including them when they were a bit younger in the Mortal Instruments series, and then having them be the focus of the Dark Artifices, however you want to say it. I say it differently all the time. Having them be the focus of that series, we already had this pre-established connection with them, and when they appeared in Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy as well. So I loved that previous connection we had with them already. So there's loads and loads of build-up even before Lady Midnight, so actually reading that, we had a history of these characters already. And then when we kind of saw it was going in a romantic direction with Emma and Julian, you do kind of root for it, because you've been rooting for both of those characters in previous books and stories. And you can just see that they're perfect for each other, even though they shouldn't really be together because of like the parabatai laws. So to see them finally give in to their feelings, no matter how much emotional pain came after that, it was a really cool punch to the air moment, because it was just that sigh of relief that they both felt the same, and it was a really, being a parabatai must be a really intimate experience anyway. So it was really interesting to see a relationship already very intimate with the parabatais become just that bit more intimate. So yeah, you really root for them as a couple throughout the book, and then when it finally happens, you're like, yes. So at number 8, it's another Simon one, sorry, he's my favourite, but it's Simon becoming a Shadowhunter in Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy, the final story of that kind of collection. As Simon was my favourite character, and he was one I've been rooting from since book 1, I developed this huge emotional connection to him throughout all 6 Mortal Instruments books. And his relationship with Izzy, I loved. His friendship with Clary, I loved. His, growing relationships and friendships with Jace and Alec, and etc, etc. It was a beautiful journey, and with Magnus as well. And then we had that kind of cruelly ripped away from us at the end of City of Heavenly Fire, when he lost his memories. And then got them back, but it's still kind of bittersweet because he didn't remember exactly everything. And then we followed him throughout Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy, working to be a Shadowhunter so we could get all his memories back. And there was like loads of trials and tribulations on the way to that journey, with him having to leave his family behind and trying to maintain a relationship with Izzy, even though he wasn't quite the same Simon that Izzy was kind of in love with. But then we saw them kind of fall in love with each other all over again. And he developed this really cool relationship with George, and finally he was ready. And we had a really beautiful sequence where Izzy and Simon sleep together for the first time, and Simon sleeps with a girl for the first time. Because in the books, Simon hasn't really slept with anyone before Isabel, whereas they changed that up in the show. Low-key angry about that, but never mind. So yeah, we followed him on this whole journey to trying to become a Shadowhunter so he could get his memories back of Izzy and Clary and all these amazing things that he'd done in the Shadow World. And when we finally see him go through the ceremony and he's okay and he becomes a proper Shadowhunter, it's just looking back at the journey he was on. He started as a mundane, then he died, then he was a vampire, then he was a daylighter, then he was a mundane again, and then he was a Shadowhunter. He went for a lot of changes, and going on that journey with him was so much, such a joy for me, because I was so emotionally invested in him as a character, and I felt such a strong connection to him. I related to him very strongly. So to see him kind of have this huge victory and become a Shadowhunter, I never would have thought when I read my book 1 or even book 2 of Mortal Instruments that one day Simon would actually be a Shadowhunter himself. Really, really cool. He got Clary as a parabatai and all that. So that whole journey was such an amazing moment, and the payoff of seeing, you know, this kind of dorky guy who was in love with his best friend rise up as this Shadowhunter is an amazing kind of journey. And I loved that moment, and I was really proud of Simon in that moment because he did it. And after all these obstacles that he had to face, he won the day and he became a Shadowhunter, which is awesome. So at number 7 is the truth about Will's curse in Clockwork Prince. Will is one of my absolute favourites in the Shadowhunters kind of universe in terms of characters. I loved his story, and you know, we'd seen him kind of fall in love with Tessa, but because of this curse he thought he had on him, because of that demon he fought when he was younger, and just this awful coincidence and this awful accident that led to his sister's death meant he believed that this demon's curse meant that anyone he loved would die. You know, it led to him believing that, even though the demon was completely lying to him. And that led to him abandoning his family to try and save them. And then when he fell in love with Tessa, you know, he couldn't really tell her how he felt because he thought it would end up killing her. So he ended up just pushing her away and breaking her heart almost, and breaking his own in the same process. So he had that kind of really emotional baggage there. And then, you know, with Magnus's help, you know, he summons that demon that put the curse on him, and we find out that the curse wasn't actually real at all. And his sister had, like, I think it was like, got like stabbed in like some kind of shard of demon skin or something, like a spike or whatever, jabbed her, and she got infected with like this poison or something that killed her. And then the whole thing, the curse, was a complete coincidence, and because Will's sister died from a complete accident with that demon, kind of all went a bit wrong, and Will believed this awful lie for so long, and he didn't want Tessa to die, and he didn't want his family to die, so he pushed them all away, and he kept himself to himself, and he only really let Jem in. And seeing Will kind of react to this revelation that he didn't need to push his family away, because this curse was a complete fabrication, and it was just an awful, awful coincidence that his sister died. It kind of led him to kind of destroy his own life, and it's really, really sad. And I wasn't expecting it at all. I thought the curse was genuine. So to have this kind of huge curveball, where Will's curse was fake, and he was in this position where he could be with Tessa, he could tell her how he felt. And I know there's like a debate, you know, Will and Tessa or Jem and Tessa. I mean, I like Jem and Tessa, I do. But if I had to choose between any of them, I prefer Will and Tessa together. But, you know, we had this huge revelation that Will wasn't cursed after all. He could be with people he loved. And so, you know, one of the first things he did then was go to tell Tessa how he felt about her and that he was in love with her. But then we find out that Jem's just proposed to Tessa and she's accepted, so it's kind of devastating all over again for Will, and the consequences of finding out the curse wasn't real, you know, had this huge impact at the end of Clockwork Prince, and then throughout the whole of Clockwork Princess as well. The ramifications of that reveal was just amazing, and I'll never get over my shock that that curse was fake. So at number 6, it's the truth about Kyle being Jordan Kyle in City of Fallen Angels from the Mortal Instruments. I did not see this coming at all, and maybe it should have been obvious, There were a few clues, like the sign outside the apartment that said Kyle, and yet he was saying that was his first name, and they normally put the surname on the door of the apartment, stuff like that. There were a few hints there, but when they dropped that absolute bombshell, it was just something else, really. So obviously we'd gotten to know Maya in previous books, and we'd learnt about like her past and everything, and what happened to her. And Jordan had been built up as this awful, awful person. And then we're introduced to Kyle, and he seems really cool, and he's good friends with Simon, and they move in together. And then we find out he's a werewolf, which is a huge shock in itself. But then we find out he's the werewolf that turned Maya, he's Maya's ex-boyfriend. Complete plot twist for me. I gasped out loud when I read that bit in the book, because I was just completely bowled over. It was the last thing I was expecting. But the clues were there, and it made sense, and it was an absolutely amazing story, and I really loved like the emotion we got out of Kyle's story in like the second half of the Mortal Instruments series, and this was such a cool kind of twist and such a cool revelation. And it's not often I have like a physical reaction to a book when I'm reading it. Like, I'll love stuff, I may cry eventually, occasionally at some bits of a book, which I'll get onto later on in this list. But I've never like, it's rare I gasp out loud when I'm reading, or I laugh out loud when I'm reading, but the Mortal Instruments made me both laugh and gasp and cry. So yeah, that was definitely one of those moments, and that's why it sticks in my mind so clearly. I think that was the first time ever I'd like gasped at a book, because what a twist. So at number 5, you know, over halfway through the list now, it's the kind of revelation and the story behind Jem being Brother Zachariah, which is obviously in City of Heavenly Fire in the Mortal Instruments, and also Clockwork Princess in the Infernal Devices. I always go to say Eternal Devices, that's not right. So we spent a lot of the Mortal Instruments knowing like Brother Zachariah is just a silent brother. And he'd been mentioned, you know, once or twice. He'd been involved in the action and stuff. And I kind of wish I'd read this I kind of wish I'd read the books in the order they came out. Because I know they like released a Mortal Instruments book, and then maybe the next year an Infernal Devices book would come out, and then it'd be like that, and they'd work together really well as like a storytelling device. So obviously you find out in the Mortal Instruments, you know, the final books that we have in the Fire, that Jem is Brother Zachariah when Jace, you know, not purposefully, but turns Brother Zachariah back into Jem. And then we see Jem actually become Brother Zachariah at the end of the Infernal Devices. So it all ties together really nicely. But the whole thing was so crazy, and I read all the Mortal Instruments first, and then I read all the Infernal Devices, and I kind of wish I'd gone in between, go back and forth, like the last couple of Mortal Instruments books with the Infernal Devices, because then I feel like the story would have absolutely blown my mind. But still, it was still a huge surprise when I found this whole thing out. But obviously, when I started the Infernal Devices, I knew that Jem was going to become a Silent Brother at the end, because I'd read the Mortal Instruments, and I kind of knew where they were going with that. But it's still like a huge revelation, and such a cool story, and a great way of keeping Jem alive, because obviously he was dying in the Infernal Devices, and if he hadn't become a Silent Brother, he would have just died. But then Jace finds a way of saving him at City of Heavenly Fire and bringing him back to the person he used to be, in a really, really cool way. And I just loved when reading it, and I put the pieces together, and, you know, he was like, this guy walks in when Jace wakes up, and he's like, I used to be Brother Zachariah. I'm like, holy shit, Jem's Brother Zachariah. how those two stories tied together so beautifully. I just loved that whole moment where we find out who Jem is destined to become. At number 4, it's Jonathan's death, or Sebastian's death, in City of Heavenly Fire. I found this really, really emotional. And this is one scene, this is like one bit in the books I always wanted to see done in the show, but then they killed Jocelyn, so we can't get this moment, and I'm not salty at all. I am a bit, obviously, but, you know, Clary kind of tricks Jonathan into trusting her, then she stabs him with the like sword and the heavenly fire and everything, so it kind of banishes all the evil from him in that moment, but kills him at the same time. And then Jonathan, or Sebastian, however you want to call him, is like lying there dying, and he kind of becomes the true Jonathan without all that evil in him, and who he would have been if Valentine hadn't, you know, done all those experiments on Jocelyn when she was pregnant. And like the Jonathan that Clary had seen in like her dreams and visions and stuff. So that was the only time really Clary got to spend with her brother, those few seconds when he was dying, and Jocelyn only really knew her son for those few seconds because that was who he really should have been. But because of Valentine, that whole thing was taken away from him, and he became this really sick and twisted young man. And that's the whole tragedy behind it. And just the image of him, you know, apologising for everything he'd done and everything he put them through. And Jocelyn's just there cradling her firstborn child and sobbing. And only really meeting him properly for the first time because this is who he should have been. But he's not long for the world because he had to be stopped. And he was just never destined to be this, you know, beautiful young man and this wonderful young man who could have been a genuinely good person. And Jocelyn lost her first child. Lost him twice, really. From the second Valentine started injecting her. And then again when Clary stabbed him. So the whole scene was just so well written and so emotional. Because obviously we'd had kind of Jonathan built up as his villain ever since book 3. So to see him finally defeated, but in such a sad, melancholy way, because there's just so much tragedy to it and so much sadness in this victory. Really, really sad, emotional moment, and it's just the image in my mind that I have of Jocelyn just there cradling her son and crying because they never really got to know each other, because the real Jonathan that he should have been was taken away before he was even born. And just the whole thing, the tragedy of that is just heartbreaking, and that just made the whole scene for me. Now, at number 3, I have number 2 and 3 are like both prologues, well, not prologues, epilogues, the other one, and I found it really hard to kind of decide which one I was going to put above the other, but I went with this one in the end. But at number 3, it's the epilogue in Clockwork Princess. And you know, everything was tied up really nicely at the end of Clockwork Princess. Will and Tessa were together and getting married and everything. Jem was, yes, a silent brother, but he was alive and he was okay. And he was going to be okay. Everything kind of worked out nicely. Then we have, like, the epilogue, which obviously helped cater to the fans of Jem and Tessa as a couple, because it gave them their happy ending, but it didn't take away from Tessa and Will's happy ending, because they lived a life together, and we see Will's death, because he dies of old age in the epilogue. There are mentions that the characters that we've met throughout this series have, passed away of old age as well, previously. And then Will's sister's there for him when he's dying. Tessa's there, the children are there. And I'm getting teary just thinking about it. And it's so beautifully written, this scene. And Will is there, dying of old age, holding Tessa's hand, and then Brother Zachariah or Jem arrives, sits down, takes Will's other hand, and only then, when the two people Will loves the most are by his side is when he dies, and he passes away with a smile. And it's such an emotional, beautiful moment, and such an amazing end to that story. Because I got so emotionally invested in Will and Tessa's relationship, and Will and Jem's kind of parabetite bond as well. Some of the most loving relationships I think Cassandra Clare's managed to write in the Shadowhunters verse. Sort of payoff of that, and seeing Will die is just so bittersweet, because he lived a life with Tessa, he got the happy ending, he was happy in the end. But you know, it was always going to happen, and he died of old age, where Tessa's just going to live on and stay looking, you know, young as she does. And knowing that he was there, you know, Magnus was there and everything, and oh, it's just such a beautiful moment. And Will got the death he deserved, and it was so beautifully written, so sad, like genuinely. This made me cry reading this bit. This is probably the first time I cried at a book. And it was just so magically done, and so well written, so sad, but also so happy. And then, you know, we kind of move forward in time a bit to after the events of City of Heavenly Fire, because after Will's death, you know, Tessa and Jem still meet once a year, and then one year when they meet up, you know, years and years after Will's died, you know, he's Jem again, because Jace kind of turned him back into Jem. And then Jem and Tessa get back together, and they get their happy ending. And I think there was like an illustrated thing, I think it's like a short story, that's all about Jessa? No, that's their ship name I suppose, but Jem and Tessa's wedding. And you see Jessamine's ghost watching over them, and Will's ghost is watching as well. And Will's just really happy for them. And oh, I'm getting really emotional. I love these three characters so much. This, you know, the relationships between those three. And he's really happy for them, and he said, I got my happy ending with Tessa, and now it's time for Jem to get his. And it's just such a beautiful way of telling that story, and making sure, you know, whoever you shipped people with, you know, they all got a happy ending in such a bittersweet way. So yeah, that whole epilogue, Will dying of old age, and then years later, Tessa and Jem get back together, kind of satisfies everyone, and it's such an amazing ending to the Infernal Devices, and I just love that so much. The emotional punches this series can kind of deliver just astound me every time. And that epilogue is probably the chapter of any Shadowhunters book I've reread the most, because it's just so stunning. So at number 2, like I mentioned previously, it's another epilogue, and this is the epilogue at the end of City of Heavenly Fire, obviously the final Mortal Instruments book. It's called like The Beauty of 1,000 Stars or something like that, or 1,000 Suns, I'm not sure. But this was kind of like wrapping up the main story threads throughout the Mortal Instruments at this big like wedding, and we see Clary meet Tessa and Jem, and Jace playing the piano. It's all happy. Magnus and Alec have this really nice chat about Robert, which I really love, because they've recently just got back together at that point. Simon appears, having got his memories back, and Simon gets his memories back in like the epilogue as well. And he shares like these moments with Clary and with Izzy, and you know, he asks her to dance and stuff. And they wrap up everything with all these characters so well, and then there's like this final image of all like the main characters on the hillside together, just happy, and it's such a really nice ending. And they easily could have just ended, Shadowhunters there, and not done any of like the spin-off series. I'm glad they did, because they're fucking great. But it's such a beautiful ending for these characters. But obviously, we do see them pop up throughout Tales of the Shadowhunter Academy, Dark Artifices, Clary and Jace pop up. Alec, I think, is in it. Magnus is in it. And Sam and Isabel are going to be in the next one that comes out in December. So it was such an amazing way of wrapping up this story, and I just love that last image of all these characters like sat together on this hillside. I don't know if they're like watching fireworks or just looking up at the stars. I think they were just looking up at the stars. After everything they've been through, it was nice to just see them all happy and content. And I felt such a genuine emotional attachment to them all over the course of 6 books, because I binge read The Mortal Instruments quite quickly. And it was kind of bittersweet for me, because I really didn't want it to end. But at the same time, what a way to end The Mortal Instruments, and it was so amazing, and I just loved it so much. Yeah, it was a beautiful way of ending such a heartbreaking and chaotic story with a moment of peace and clarity. I thought it was done beautifully. I'm going to try and not get emotional with this one, but at number 1, my favourite book moment from the Shadowhunters verse is Will and Jem's goodbye in Clockwork Princess. It's basically, Tessa's kind of been taken by Axel Mortmain, like the main villain of the Infernal Devices, and Jem and Will were going to go after her, but Jem's too weak, and he is, in his final hours, he's about to die. And Will wanted to stay with him until the very end, so he could be there when he died. But Jem said, Will, you have to go and save Tessa. You don't stay for me, go and save her. And Magnus was like, I'll keep him comfortable until the end. And they have to say goodbye. I mean, it wasn't the last time they ever saw each other, obviously, because Jem ended up being okay. But they thought this would be the last time they'd ever see each other. And, Jem did actually kind of die, because Will's Parabatide mark faded, and he went through all that agonising pain of the mark fading, because his Parabatide died. So this was like what they thought would be their final goodbye. And Jem kind of found out that Will was in love with Tessa, and kind of gave his blessing for them to be together, which is just so beautiful and so Jem. So very Jem. What a Jem. And they have this really emotional, intimate moment, because they're basically brothers, and their Parabatide bond is one of my absolute favourites. And it does feel a lot like the Jason Alec kind of bond. But there's something beautiful in the way that Will agreed to be Jem's Parabatide, even though he knew Jem was dying, and he knew he was always going to have to suffer that pain of the mark going. But it was worth it for him anyway. And they just had this amazing goodbye, and Will says something along the lines of, if there is a life after this one, I hope I meet you in it, James Carstairs. And that line fucking destroyed me when I first read it. Actually no, it wasn't, because it wasn't the epilogue of Clockwork Princess that made me cry for the first time reading the book. It was still Clockwork Princess, but this bit, which came earlier on, I had to put it down for 10 minutes, because I was just like, this is too much. Such a beautiful goodbye scene. Even though it wasn't really a goodbye, because Jem was okay, but he did say goodbye to Jem, because obviously after that he was brother Zachariah. So he actually never really saw Jem again after that moment, because he was brother Zachariah until the day he died. So Will really did say goodbye to Jem, I suppose, if you look at it like that. But yeah, that whole thing, if there's a life after this one, I hope I meet you in it. The feels were reals, and such an emotionally driven scene. These two so well established characters over the course of 3 books, all kind of building to this moment. These two parabatai who were in love with the same woman, but they didn't let that drive them apart. It made them stronger, and this deep love they had for each other, you know, allowed them to have this really poignant and beautiful and bittersweet farewell, believing that Jem was going to die within the next few hours. Beautiful, beautiful scene. Even if you know, if you're watching this and you don't read the books, you're just watching because you're curious, which is cool. Thanks for sticking around. If you read any Shadowhunter book thing ever, if you read even the slightest snippet, try and find this bit in the book where Jem and Will say goodbye. It may not have the same impact because you may not have read the whole Infernal Devices series up to this point. But my god, it's a beautifully written scene. An amazing sequence, really emotional. First time I've ever cried at a book, and I think that's why it sticks with me so much. But because I love these characters so deeply, and I'm so invested in their story, that moment is just so beautiful. And I'll never forget reading that for the first time. I can picture it so clearly, and yeah, I go back to it quite often. And yeah, it's just one of the most emotionally driven parts of a book I've ever read, and it will stay with me for the rest of my life. So those were my top 10 book moments from the whole Shadowhunters verse. I say I kind of found it quite easy to coming up with this 10. I did come up with quite a few. I came up with like 20 moments just off the top of my head. I didn't even have to think about some of them. But you know, some just couldn't make the cut. But there were so many moments I love. And probably some moments that would have made it on the list I've just completely forgotten about or overlooked. But those are the top 10 that I'm sticking with. And yeah, these books really do move me because I'm just so connected to the characters, and some of the relationships and everything is just so well written. And yeah, if you haven't read the books, I really do implore you to read them or give them a try, because I think there's something for everyone in the Shadowhunters series, to be honest, or the Shadowhunters Chronicles, to give it its proper name. But yeah, those were just 10 moments to me that really stood out over my journey of reading all the books. So yeah, that's that for now, and until the next top 10, because I'm sure there are a few more in this countdown to go yet, and well, whatever the next few videos are. Until the next video, I'll see you then. Thanks for watching.